Like, welcome back, listeners. Have you ever been truly, entirely isolated? I don't mean spending a quiet Friday night alone in your apartment, insulated by the glow of a television and the distant hum of traffic. I mean profoundly disconnected from the rest of humanity. Cut off. Untethered. There's a specific kind of silence that accompanies true isolation, and it is almost never empty. When the noise of civilization fades away, the mind begins to fill the void. Or worse, the void fills itself. Tonight, we are journeying into the freezing dark. We have 3 accounts from individuals who sought out the quiet, who welcomed the solitude of winter, only to discover that the cold hides things. It preserves them, and sometimes, when the blizzard wipes the world white, it brings those things right to your front door. Like, lock your deadbolts, turn up the heat, and listen closely. Tale 1. The Floorboards Above. Our first account takes us to the sprawling, desolate plains of South Dakota. About 5 years ago, our narrator made a decision that many of us fantasize about but rarely execute. They decided to leave the noise behind. Pressured by their parents to finally move out and start an independent life, they sought out the most remote habitation they could reasonably afford. They weren't a social butterfly. They craved quiet, and they found it in a small, isolated house tucked away in a snow-battered region of the state, where the nearest neighbor was a long, arduous trek down a lonely road. For the first few years, this existence was perfectly, blissfully uneventful. They went to work, they drove home, they existed in a peaceful vacuum. They never bothered to learn the names of their neighbors. Out there, the sheer distance between properties acts as a social buffer. You could easily go weeks without laying eyes on another human being. Then came a Tuesday in early February. The narrator was at work when the sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. At first, it was just a light dusting, the kind of picturesque snow that looks beautiful through an office window. But within a single hour, the atmosphere mutated. The wind began to howl, tearing across the flat plains, whipping the snow into a blinding, impenetrable curtain of white. Visibility plummeted to absolute zero. The roads transformed from asphalt to treacherous ribbons of ice. Recognizing the danger, the boss dismissed the staff early. The narrator climbed into their lifted truck, feeling a false sense of security. They were accustomed to bad weather, and the heavy, elevated vehicle had always conquered the snow before. The doctor home was a white-knuckle nightmare, peering through the windshield at a world that had been completely erased, but eventually erased. The tires crunched into the familiar gravel of their own driveway. Relief washed over them. Wait. They trudged up the steps to the front porch, pulling their keys from their pocket, shivering as the sub-zero wind cut right through their heavy coat. They slid the key into the deadbolt and turned. It didn't move. They jiggled it, pressed harder. The lock was entirely frozen solid. A spike of panic hit their chest. They didn't have a lighter. They didn't have a blowtorch jar. They tried frantically blowing hot air onto the frozen metal, cupping their bare hands around the icy brass, even striking the door with the side of their fist in sheer, desperate frustration. The mechanism remained paralyzed. Defeated and freezing, they retreated to the cab of the truck. They cranked the heater to its absolute maximum, holding their numb fingers in front of the vents. They'll just wait it out, they rationalized. The storm will break in an hour or two. You'll figure it out then. But the storm did not break. Sitting in the idling truck, peering out through the wiper blades, the narrator watched the snow swallow the world. The drifts were rising at a terrifying pace. Within 10 minutes, the sickening realization set in. Waiting was a death sentence. The truck was already half buried. Even with the lifted suspension, driving back out onto the main road was no longer physically possible. They shifted into reverse, pressing the gas. The tires just spun, whining uselessly against the packed ice. They were wrapped. The parents lived hours away. They had no phone numbers for anyone nearby. If they stayed in the truck, the gas tank would inevitably run dry, the engine would choke and die, and they would be entombed inside a freezing metal box. There was only one option left. They had to walk. They had to trudge a quarter of a mile through a violent blizzard to knock on a stranger's door and beg for sanctuary. The narrator zipped up their coat and stepped out into the howling void. The cold was an absolute physical assault. It burned the lungs and felt like needles driving into the exposed skin of their face. By the time the silhouette of the nearest house finally materialized through the whiteout, the narrator was violently, uncontrollably shivering. It was a small, dilapidated, one-story structure. It looked weathered and exhausted, barely standing against the wind. The narrator pounded on the front door with frozen fists. They waited. The wind screamed in their ears. Just as they were about to give up and turn toward the next impossible trek, the door violently wrenched open. The narrator actually stumbled backward. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked to be in his 50s. His face was entirely nondescript, unremarkable in every way, except for the absolute blankness of his expression. He just stared at the shivering narrator, without uttering a single syllable. "Fight." Finally, the man muttered his name. "Chow." The narrator, teeth chattering, frantically explained their frozen lock, the stuck truck, the desperate need for shelter. Joe offered a slow, almost mechanical nod, and took a step back, gesturing for the narrator to enter. Warmth hit the narrator's face, bringing an immediate rush of relief. But as the heavy front door clicked shut, sealing out the roaring blizzard, that relief was instantly replaced by a deep, primal unease. Something was wrong. Joe guided the narrator into the living room, offering a spot on a worn, sunken couch, before taking a seat opposite them in a frayed armchair. The narrator, trying to be a polite guest, attempted small talk, but Joe wasn't really engaging. His eyes were incredibly erratic. While the narrator spoke, Joe's gaze darted frantically around the small room. He looked at the floor. He looked at the ceiling. He stared intently at a spot on the wall, just over the narrator's left shoulder. It was as if he was tracking the movements of an invisible insect, entirely incapable of maintaining eye contact for more than a fleeting second. When Joe did speak, his sentences were fragmented. He would start a thought, trail off into complete silence, and just stare blankly through the drywall. The narrator's initial thought was simple social awkwardness. He's just an isolated hermit who isn't used to company. But the longer they sat in that stifling, quiet room, the heavier the dread became. The air felt thick. The narrator's instincts began to scream that they were locked in a small box with a deeply unstable individual. Wanting to minimize any further interaction, the narrator claimed extreme exhaustion and asked if it would be all right to just sleep on the couch. A bizarre wave of relief seemed to wash over Joe's nondescript face. He eagerly agreed. The narrator asked him to kill the lights. Joe reached over and clicked the lamp off. The room plunged into heavy darkness. But Joe didn't leave. Through half-slit eyes, the narrator could see Joe standing perfectly still in the entryway of the living room. For a full, agonizing minute, the man did not move a single muscle. He didn't breathe heavily. He just stood there, staring into the dark. The narrator kept their breathing steady, desperately feigning sleep, their heart hammering violently against their ribs. Finally, the floorboards creaked as Joe slowly receded down the hallway toward the back bedroom. The narrator lay in the dark, muscles coiled tight. The couch was surprisingly comfortable, and the physical exhaustion of the freezing walk was pulling them toward sleep. But their brain refused to shut down. Every time they hovered on the edge of unconsciousness, their eyes would snap open, straining to listen over the muffled howling of the blizzard outside. About an hour passed. And then, the noises started. Thump. Scrape. Thump. The narrator froze. The sounds were muffled, but they were distinct, and they were coming from directly above the ceiling. At first, the desperate, rationalizing part of the brain tried to explain it away. It's just heavy snow sliding off the roof. It's the wind dripping at the shingles. But the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't the chaotic scraping of weather. It was deliberate. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across wooden floorboards. The narrator lay flat on their back, staring up into the pitch-black ceiling, a cold sweat breaking out across their forehead. The geometry of the nightmare suddenly clicked into place. This is a one-story house. There was no second floor. There was no attic big enough for a person. So what in God's name was pacing back and forth up there? Like, the heavy, sporadic thumps continued for several agonizing minutes. The narrator was paralyzed, caught between the terror of the ceiling and the fear of waking the man down the hall. And then, without a single warning, like a deafening, violent crash erupted from the ceiling above. It was so forceful it seemed to shake the dust from the drywall. The narrator violently shot upright on the couch, gasping for air. And as their eyes adjusted to the dark, they saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He hadn't made a sound approaching. He must have been standing there, perfectly still in the dark, just watching the narrator sleep. A sickening, prickly heat washed over the narrator's skin. Like, they opened their mouth to speak, to ask what that horrible noise was, to ask why he was standing there. Before a single syllable could form, Joe lunged. He didn't just walk forward. He charged. He launched his body over the back of the couch, crashing entirely onto the narrator, driving them both down hard onto the carpeted floor. It was pure, chaotic violence. The narrator thrashed wildly in the dark, feeling Joe's thick, surprisingly powerful arms snake around their neck, locking in a suffocating chokehold. "Stop fighting," Joe screamed, his breath hot and frantic against the narrator's aerators. "Stop fighting." Light. The narrator clawed at the arm crushing their windpipe, gasping for air, kicking wildly at the coffee table. And then, Joe started ranting. "Sheth's lonely," he shrieked, his voice cracking with a terrifying, unhinged grief. "Sheth, so lonely. She'll find you good company. You're gonna be good company for her." The narrator wasn't processing the words. Like, they were fighting for their life, driven by the sheer, primal adrenaline of survival. The narrator planted a foot against the base of the couch, arched their back violently, and broke the man's leverage. They shoved Joe off with everything they had, scrambling frantically to their feet. They didn't grab their coat. They didn't grab their keys. They sprinted for the front door, ripping it open, and threw themselves back out into the freezing vortex of the blizzard. As they fled into the blinding snow, they heard Joe's voice scream out from the doorway behind them, tearing through the wind, "Sheth's not gonna be happy." The narrator ran blindly. They didn't feel the cold. They didn't feel the wind. They ran on pure terror until they slammed into the porch of the next property down the road. A husband and wife, Brandon and Kathy, opened the door. Taking one look at the terrified, shivering, coatless stranger, they pulled the narrator inside without a single question. The next morning, as the sun finally broke through the clouds and illuminated the snow-choked world, the narrator sat at the kitchen table, wrapping their hands around a mug of coffee. They recounted the entire horrifying night to the couple. When the narrator described the dilapidated one-story house, Brandon stopped them. "What? Was it Joe?" Brandon asked, his face entirely devoid of surprise. The narrator nodded slowly. Brandon exhaled, exchanging a dark look with his wife. He explained that Joe had been a deeply unsettling fixture in that remote area for a very long time. But it was the next piece of information that made the narrator's blood run completely cold. A decade earlier, Joe's wife had vanished without a single trace. There was no body. There was never an official investigation strong enough to yield an arrest. But everyone in the county, every neighbor who lived miles apart, whispered the exact same suspicion. Joe had killed her, and Joe had hidden the body. The narrator thought back to the horrific, heavy thumping coming from the ceiling of a one-story house. They thought about the chokehold in the dark, and Joe's frantic screams about his wife needing company. The police were eventually called. The report was filed, but out there in the secluded snow, little was done. 3 years have passed since that blizzard. The narrator, inexplicably, still lives in their same house. They still doctor past Joe's dilapidated property. But they never look at the roof, because they know exactly who is still up there, waiting in the dark. Tale 2. The Clean Boots. If the first story was about the terror of being trapped inside a stranger's house, our next account explores the exact inverse. The psychological horror of being trapped inside your own home, while a stranger desperately tries to get in. Our second narrator is 27 years old, living alone in a small rental house nestled deep in the woods of upstate New York. By day, they are a remote finance worker. Their life is confined to the warm glow of monitors and endless grids of spreadsheets. Night, they are a homebody by nature, perfectly content to let the world spin on without them. It was the dead of winter, and the local news networks were caught in their usual frenzy. A supposedly historic, life-threatening blizzard was barreling toward the coast. Normally, the narrator ignored the hype. Most storms promised the apocalypse and delivered 3 inches of slush. But the radar maps for this system looked vicious. The authorities were urging residents to stockpile essentials and stay off the roads at all costs. Like, the narrator did their civic duty. They grabbed groceries that morning, locked the doors, and settled into the couch, fully prepared for a mundane, cozy weekend of isolation. But the snow began falling heavily by mid-afternoon. By 0 p.m., the storm had achieved a terrifying velocity. Looking out the front window, the narrator could barely see past the wooden beams of their own porch. The wind wasn't a fluctuating breeze. It was a continuous, deafening roar, as if a freight train were perpetually passing right over the roof. At 10:30 p.m., cutting through the monotonous howl of the wind, came a distinct sound. Light, thud. It was heavy, dull, and undeniably close. It was immediately followed by a long, slow dragging noise, like something massive and dense being pulled across the wooden planks of the porch. The narrator paused the television. The rational brain immediately provided an excuse. A massive oak branch finally snapped under the weight of the ice and dragged across the deck. It made perfect sense. The narrator relaxed, sinking back into the cushions. 15 minutes later, 10:45 p.m., a sound pierced the storm. Hugged. It was a car horn, but it wasn't a blaring, desperate alarm. It was weak, intermittent, almost like a heavy hand was weakly slipping and grazing the steering wheel. The narrator cautiously approached the front window, cupping their hands against the cold glass to block out the living room glare. Peering into the chaotic swirl of white, they spotted it. Parked at the very end of their long driveway were 2 headlights, cutting weak, yellow cones into the blizzard. The vehicle was completely stationary. The narrator watched intently for 5 full minutes, waiting to see a driver emerge, waiting to see a shadow move behind the snowy windshield. Nothing, just the idling lights. A wave of guilt washed over them. Someone had clearly slid off the treacherous, icy road. It happened all the time out here, but the instinct for self-preservation is a powerful deterrent. Trudging out into a blinding, sub-zero whiteout to approach an unidentified vehicle in the dead of night was not a risk they were willing to take. Night. They have heat in the car, the narrator thought. They'll wait for a plow. They returned to the couch. At exactly 11. Like 0 p.m., a violent, urgent pounding echoed against the front door. The narrator jolted upright. But the pounding did not stop. It was frantic, the heavy thuds vibrating through the drywall. The narrator didn't touch the doorknob. They stood to feet back and shouted over the noise of the storm. "Who is it?" A man's voice filtered through the heavy wood. It sounded weak, strained, and completely out of breath. "My car is stuck. Please, I need to come inside and use your phone. I'm freezing." The guilt flared again. If this man had been wandering through the blizzard, the elements were actively killing him. But the primal, animal instinct of fear kept the narrator's hand hovering over the lock. You do not open your door to a stranger in the middle of nowhere. Compromising, the narrator slid the heavy metal security chain into place. They turned the deadbolt and cracked the door open just 2 inches, the cold wind instantly howling through the gap. Standing on the porch was a man, shorter than the narrator. He was a portrait of winter survival. Snow was thickly caked onto the shoulders of his heavy jacket. Ice was matted into his hair. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering as he pleaded. Claiming his phone was deadened, he had been trekking through the drifts for miles looking for a porch light. The narrator's hand moved toward the security chain, preparing to slide it out of the track and let the freezing man inside. But right at that exact moment, the narrator's eyes dropped downward. They looked at the man's boots, and a sensation of pure, liquid terror flooded the narrator's stomach. The man's heavy winter boots were immaculate. They were entirely, impossibly clean. And more importantly, they were bone dry. If this man had been trudging through knee-deep snowdrifts for miles, his boots would be packed with compacted snow. They would be rimmed with melting ice and dark, wet sludge. This man had not been walking through the storm. He had just stepped out of a perfectly warm, running vehicle mere seconds ago. The snow on his shoulders wasn't from a long trek. It was from standing on the porch, waiting. He was lying. The narrator's voice went dead flat. "I will call 911 for you. They'll send a truck." The man's demeanor instantly shifted. The shivering stopped. The weak, pleading tone vanished. He stepped closer to the crack in the door, his voice dropping into a hard, demanding register. "What?" The narrator slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. They could hear the man's muffled voice shouting something angry through the wood, but the narrator was already sprinting for the kitchen counter, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher answered. The narrator frantically whispered the situation, and as they spoke, the horrific sound of crunching snow echoed from outside. The heavy, deliberate footsteps moved off the front porch. They crunched along the side of the house, moving toward the back. The dispatcher ordered the narrator to check every lock and warned that due to the severe whiteout conditions, police cruisers would be heavily delayed. The narrator crept into the darkened dining room, peering through the side window into the blizzard. Standing in the yard, about 15 feet away from the house, was the man. He wasn't moving. He was just standing perfectly still in the raging snow, his head tilted upward, staring dead-eyed into the windows. A few agonizing minutes later, the silence of the house was shattered. Bang! 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 It was coming from the back door. The man was violently throwing his entire body weight against the frame. The wood groaned and splintered under the assault, the hinges screaming. The narrator dropped the phone, grabbed the longest, sharpest chef's knife from the kitchen block, and fled down the hallway into their bedroom. They locked the bedroom door, backed into the furthest corner of the room, raised the knife, and waited for the sound of shattering glass. The violent banging continued for a full minute. And then, it stopped. The house plunged back into the eerie, isolated silence of the storm. The narrator stood completely frozen in the dark, the knife trembling in their hands, time losing all meaning. It felt like hours. It was likely 20 minutes. Suddenly, from the end of the driveway, the car horn sounded again. Like one long, continuous, wailing blast that slowly faded as the vehicle finally drove away. 30 minutes later, the spinning red and blue lights of the police cruisers finally pierced the snow. The officers knocked. The narrator, still clutching the knife, let them in. The police scoured the road. They found a vehicle abandoned in a snowbank a half-mile down the asphalt, far away from where the headlights had been idling. When the officers popped the hood, the engine block was entirely cold to the touch. It had been sitting there dead for hours. It wasn't the car the man had been driving. But here is the detail that will keep you awake tonight. The police conducted a perimeter search around the narrator's property. They found the heavy boot prints leading down the driveway, up to the porch, and wrapping around the back door. But they found absolutely no footprints leading from the road to the driveway. The snow between the end of the driveway and the asphalt was perfectly, terrifyingly, untouched. It was as if the man had not walked up to the house at all. He had driven a second, unseen vehicle silently up the driveway, stepped out cleanly onto the porch, and when he was denied entry, he simply drove away. But the horror didn't end that night. The next morning, the storm broke. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue. The narrator nervously walked outside to inspect the damage to the back door. As they rounded the corner of the house, they stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the exterior glass of their bedroom window. Pressed against the glass, right at eye level, were muddy, smeared handprints. The police had searched that exact area the night before, shining their heavy flashlights across the siding. The handprints had not been there, which means the man didn't leave when the car horn sounded. He had waited. He had hidden in the blinding snow, watching the police arrive, watching the police leave. And then, in the dead of night, he had walked right up to the bedroom window, pressed his hands against the glass, and peered inside at the sleeping narrator. A few days later, the local news reported that a house a half-mile away had been broken into during the height of the blizzard. The homeowners were out of town. The back door was kicked in. But absolutely nothing of value was taken. Televisions, jewelry, cash, all left untouched. Whoever was out in that storm wasn't hunting for property. They were hunting for something else entirely. And to this day, the narrator thanks whatever guardian angel made them look down at a pair of perfectly clean boots. Tale 3. The Phantom of the Backcountry. Our final story takes us away from the safety of four walls, and thrusts us directly into the unforgiving, lethal majesty of the mountains. Our narrator is 34 years old, residing in the rugged terrain of British Columbia. They are not an amateur thrill seeker. For most of their 20s, they were a highly competitive, professional alpine ski racer. They spent their youth hurtling down sheer, ice-terrifying speeds until the sheer accumulation of physical trauma forced an early retirement at age 26. But retirement from racing didn't mean abandoning the snow. It simply meant trading the crowded resort slopes for the desolate, untouched powder of the backcountry. To understand this story, you must understand the preparation involved. Backcountry skiing is not a casual hobby. It demands exhaustive training. The narrator was certified in wilderness first aid and possessed advanced avalanche survival training. They were meticulous. They checked the weather. They analyzed the snowpack. The plan that morning was a simple day trip into a remote, isolated mountain range a few hours north. The meteorological forecast called for light, manageable snowfall. The avalanche danger was rated low. It was supposed to be a pristine, quiet day of carving untouched lines. The narrator arrived at the base just after sunrise, attached the climbing skins to the bottom of their skis, and began the grueling, rhythmic ascent up the mountain. But high-elevation microclimates are treacherous, unpredictable beasts. Halfway up the ascent, the atmosphere shifted aggressively. The light, powdery snowfall rapidly mutated into heavy, dense flakes. The wind abruptly changed direction, howling with an intensity entirely absent from the morning forecast. The horizon vanished as visibility plummeted into a terrifying gray soup. Every single protocol, every ounce of survival training, screamed at the narrator to strip their skins, turn around, and ski back to the car immediately. But the siren song of the mountain is powerful. The narrator was standing at the crest of a beautiful, untouched line they had been dreaming about all week. Hubris took the wheel. Just one run, they told themselves. Wike, one quick descent, and him out. It is a lie that has filled countless body bags in the backcountry. The descent began smoothly. The narrator was carving conservatively, feeling the terrain, respecting the dropping visibility. They made it 2/3 of the way down the face of the mountain. And then, the slope shattered. Unless you have experienced it, it is impossible to conceptualize the sheer, violent speed of an avalanche. It does not rumble like a train in the distance. It is an instantaneous catastrophic failure of the ground beneath your feet. 1 millisecond you are completely in control, manipulating gravity. The next millisecond, the entire world gives way, and you are entirely at the mercy of millions of pounds of churning liquid ice. It was a class avalanche, not massive enough to bury a town, but violently powerful enough to erase a human. The narrator was instantly swept off their feet, thrown into a chaotic, terrifying tumble inside the white washing machine. Up and down ceased to exist. They tumbled helplessly for 40 yards before their body slammed into something immovably solid buried beneath the snowpack, likely a jagged boulder or a submerged tree trunk. The deceleration was instantaneous and brutal. The narrator lay gasping in the snow, the world spitting. The specialized bindings on their skis had functioned perfectly, ejecting the heavy planks to prevent their legs from snapping in half. But as the adrenaline receded, the agony arrived. The narrator attempted to shift their weight and immediately collapsed with a scream. The pain radiating from their left leg was absolutely blinding. It wasn't just a tweak. It was a profound, structural failure of the joint. They couldn't bear even an ounce of weight on it. Sitting in the crater of the avalanche debris, the narrator took stock of their grim reality. Why, one ski was gone, swallowed by the mountain. The snow was now falling so heavily, it was bordering on a whiteout. The temperature was plummeting. They ran the survival calculus in their head. Like, 3 options. White. 1, stay put and wait for rescue. But they were skiing so low, and no one would even realize they were missing until nightfall. Death by hypothermia. 2, dig a snow cave and wait out the storm. But they possessed no overnight thermal gear. Death by exposure. 3, stand up, endure unimaginable agony, and try to drag their shattered body down the rest of the mountain before the blizzard erased them entirely. They chose agony. Using their single remaining ski pole as a desperate, flimsy crutch, the narrator began to violently drag themselves downhill. Every single lurch forward sent shockwaves of nausea and blinding pain through their nervous system. The wind howled, drowning out their ragged breathing. The snow blinded them. They were entirely alone at the edge of the world, slowly fading. And then, cutting through the roaring wind, they heard a sound behind them. Light. The narrator froze. The logical brain immediately diagnosed the sound as an auditory hallucination. The hypothermia is setting in. The brain is firing randomly as it shuts down. But the human instinct for hope is relentless. The narrator painfully twisted their torso and looked back up the blinding white slope. Emerging from the heavy curtain of falling snow was a figure. It was a man, another backcountry skier, fully equipped, gliding effortlessly down the treacherous terrain directly toward them. The narrator was overwhelmed by an entirely alien emotion. It wasn't just pure relief. It was a bizarre, heavy cocktail of skepticism, profound terror, and an uncanny sense of wrongness. The figure slid to a graceful halt, mere feet away. He casually pulled off his heavy winter helmet to adjust his mirrored goggles. He looked at the narrator, broken and bleeding in the snow, and simply asked, "Are you hurt?" The narrator babbled out the situation. The avalanche, the shattered leg, the missing ski. The man didn't hesitate. He didn't pull out a radio. He didn't check for cell service. He immediately stepped out of his bindings, walked through the deep powder, and hoisted the narrator upwards, throwing the narrator's heavy arms securely over his broad shoulders. Together, they began the agonizing three-legged march down the mountain. The narrator leaned heavily against the stranger, feeling the undeniable, physical mass of a human body supporting their weight. But the uncanny feeling only intensified. The interaction felt dreamlike, staged. The narrator distinctly felt that this man had not stumbled upon them by accident. They engaged in scattered, exhausted small talk to stay conscious. Most of the words dissolved into the wind, but one specific sentence the stranger uttered burned itself permanently into the narrator's memory. The man, trudging through the heavy snow, looked forward and casually said, "I haven't used my legs in a long time. It's nice to get back on solid ground." The narrator, delirious with pain, didn't process the sheer impossibility of the statement. They assumed it was strange skier slang, a joke about being off the slopes for a season. They just kept their head down, focusing on the agonizing rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. About an hour into the grueling descent, the narrator's body hit an absolute wall. Mate, the pain was too much. They desperately needed a break. Spotting a large, snow-caked pine tree, the narrator detached from the stranger, hobbled over, and leaned their back heavily against the rough bark. Exhausted beyond measure, the narrator closed their eyes, just for 4 seconds. For agonizingly long seconds to breathe. When they opened their eyes, they turned to thank the stranger. The man was gone. The space where he had been standing, less than 5 feet away, was entirely empty. The narrator blinked, confusion rapidly giving way to rising panic. "Hey!" They screamed into the howling wind. "Where are you?" Only the wind answered. The narrator frantically scanned the immediate area, the adrenaline temporarily masking the pain in their leg. Like, there were no trees dense enough to hide behind. The terrain was relatively open. Unless the man had instantly buried himself beneath the snowpack, it was physically impossible for him to vanish. And then, the narrator looked down at the ground. There, etched clearly in the fresh powder, was the deep, dragging trench of the narrator's own broken, agonizing descent. But right beside it were the heavy, supportive boots of the stranger should have crushed the snow. There was nothing. The snow was perfectly, impossibly pristine. There were no tracks leading up to the tree. There were no tracks walking away from the tree. The only evidence of passage belonged entirely to the narrator. A wave of dizzying, nauseating terror slammed into the narrator's chest. The physical memory of the man's heavy shoulder under their arm was undeniable. They had leaned half their body weight onto a physical object for over an hour. How could they move that fast, cover that much ground, entirely alone? The rational brain shattered. Had the trauma induced a hyper-realistic, physical hallucination? Were they already dead, wandering as a ghost on the mountain? There was no time to solve the impossible. The blizzard was intensifying. Driven by pure, unadulterated fear, the narrator hobbled the remaining mile entirely alone, driven by a stubborn, primal refusal to die in the snow. They miraculously reached the vehicle. They drove the treacherous roads back to civilization. In the bright, sterile lights of the emergency room, the doctors diagnosed a severely torn ligament, marveling at the narrator's sheer luck in surviving the exposure. The narrator spent the next few days bedridden at home, their leg elevated in a heavy brace, their mind endlessly looping the footage of the phantom skier. They tried to build a logical fortress. It was shock. It was hypothermia. My brain invented a savior to force my body to keep moving. But the fortress crumbled a few weeks later. Scrolling mindlessly through a local backcountry tracking website, the narrator froze. Staring back from the screen was a somber news report. A few weeks prior to the narrator's accident, a solo backcountry skier had been caught in a violent storm on that exact same remote mountain range. Search and rescue had combed the area for days. They found nothing. The man had been swallowed by the mountain. His body was never recovered. The article contained no photograph. There were no social media profiles to cross-reference. The narrator will never possess the concrete, terrifying proof of comparing a face on a screen to the face behind the mirrored goggles. But as they sit in their living room, staring at their healing leg, they remember the physical weight of the arm. They remember the crunch of the snow, and they remember the phantom's voice echoing over the howling wind. I haven't used my legs in a long time. It's nice to get back on solid ground. The narrator still skis, but they never, ever go into the backcountry alone, because they know that on that mountain, the dead don't rest. They patrol the snow. Thank you for joining us tonight. Remember to check your locks, watch the tree lines, and stay out of the cold. We will see you next time, in the dark. Step into the dark with me. Take a moment and think about the places where you feel most secure. Maybe it is the profound, untouched isolation of a frozen wilderness, miles away from the nearest breathing soul. Maybe it is the vibrant, beating heart of a crowded city street, surrounded by hundreds of people on a warm summer night. Or maybe, and most likely, it is behind the locked doors of your own home, wrapped in the quiet comfort of your nightly routine. We build these sanctuaries in our minds. We draw lines in the sand and tell ourselves that if we just cross over them, the monsters cannot follow. But what happens when the isolation you sought becomes a trap? What happens when the crowd parts to reveal something utterly wrong? What happens when the call is coming from inside the house? Tonight, we are going to explore 3 distinct accounts, 3 different settings, 3 separate reminders that the illusion of safety is exactly that, an illusion. And that sometimes, the most terrifying thing in the world is simply paying attention to your surroundings. Take a breath. Lock your doors. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in the dead of winter, deep inside a sprawling, untouched forest. It is a heavy, suffocating quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I learned it a long time ago, back when my father first taught me how to navigate the wilderness. The deep snow acts as a natural acoustic dampener. It absorbs the ambient noise of the world, swallowing the wind, the rustle of dead branches, and the scurry of small animals. It leaves you alone with the sound of your own heartbeat. Last winter, I craved that exact silence. I had hit a wall at work. The endless emails, the constant ringing of phones, the sheer, exhausting proximity of other human beings. It had all become too much. I needed to unplug. I needed to disappear for a few days. So, I packed my truck to the brim with winter survival gear, called for my dog, Roscoe, and set my sights on a state forest located hours away from any major highway. The drive was agonizingly slow. The trail I had selected on my map barely qualified as a road. It was a narrow, winding cut through an ocean of dense, towering pines. The county clearly hadn't maintained it in months. The asphalt was completely hidden beneath a treacherous, compacted layer of slick ice and hard packed snow. My truck fishtailed more than once, the tires fighting for purchase against the frozen earth. I didn't pass a single car. I didn't see a single cabin. There were no tire tracks ahead of me. I was entirely alone. After roughly an hour of white-knuckle driving, I finally spotted a small, overgrown pull-off on the shoulder of the trail. It looked abandoned, completely buried under a pristine white blanket of snow. I eased the truck into the clearing, threw it in park, and cut the engine. The sudden absence of the engine's rumble was deafening. I strapped on my heavy pack, checked my gear, and signaled for Roscoe to follow. We hiked for another grueling 20 minutes, pushing deep into the tree line. Far away from the trail line, the snow here was knee-deep and pristine. Not a single footprint, not a snapped twig, nothing. It was an untouched canvas of winter isolation. This was exactly what I wanted. We found a small, natural clearing surrounded by a thick fortress of ancient trees. I dropped my heavy pack into the snow, my muscles burning with relief. While I began the laborious task of kicking away the top layer of powder to clear a footprint for my tent, Roscoe treated the frozen woods like a playground. He bounded through the drifts, burying his snout in the snow, chasing invisible scents, and rolling in the ice. He stayed close, his joyful energy a stark contrast to the desolate environment. Setting up camp in sub-zero temperatures is a battle of attrition. The ground was rock solid, frozen completely through. I had to hammer my tent stakes into the earth with relentless force, securing the nylon shelter against any potential winter winds. Inside, I meticulously arranged my winter-rated sleeping bag over an insulated pad. I knew the temperature was going to plummet drastically as soon as the sun dipped below the tree line. I was already layered for survival, thermal-based garments clinging to my skin, thick wool socks, a heavy fleece mid-layer, and a dense, wind-proof outer jacket. I kept every single layer on. With my shelter secured, I ventured out to forage for deadwood. I managed to construct a modest fire, pit and coaxed a flame to life. I fed it patiently until the damp wood caught, building a steady, crackling blaze that pushed back the encroaching shadows. I cooked a simple, utilitarian meal over the open flames, the smell of charred food mixing with the sharp scent of pine. I sat down on a frost-covered log to eat, my muscles aching, while Roscoe curled into a tight, warm ball near the edge of the fire pit. The darkness fell fast, and with it came that oppressive, snowy silence. I had just finished my meal when the quiet was violently shattered. "Night." Roscoe snapped his head up, his ears pinned back. He leapt to his feet, his body rigid, and began barking aggressively into the dense, black wall of trees just beyond the firelight. At first, my pulse barely hitched. We were in the middle of a massive state forest. Deer, raccoons, coyotes, the woods were teeming with wildlife, and Roscoe had a habit of announcing every squirrel he laid eyes on. I reached out, resting a gloved hand on his head, and softly commanded him to stand down. He huffed, his eyes still locked on the darkness, but he eventually lowered himself back onto the snow. I settled back onto my log, checking my watch. It was early, but the cold was already biting at my exposed skin. I figured I would sit by the fire for another half hour before retreating into the thermal cocoon of my sleeping bag. I rested my hand against my hip, feeling the reassuring, cold steel of the handgun secured in my holster. I never ventured into remote wilderness without it. It was a strict personal rule, and sitting there, feeling the weight of it, I felt completely secure. 20 minutes bled by. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks spiraling up into the black canopy. Light. Then, Roscoe erupted. It wasn't a warning bark this time. It was a frantic, vicious, booming sound that tore through my chest. He wasn't barking at a deer. And then, over the sound of my dogs roaring protests, I heard it too. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crushing the crystallized snow just beyond the perimeter of my camp. I shot up from the log, my hand instinctively dropping to the grip of my firearm. I strained my eyes against the darkness. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The woods held their breath. Then, the rhythmic crunching started again, slow and methodical. Roscoe's frantic barking suddenly choked off, shifting into a low, rumbling, guttural growl that vibrated in his throat. And then he went completely, terrifyingly silent. He stood frozen, staring unblinking at a specific point in the tree line. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck, freezing almost instantly against my skin. I followed my dog's unblinking gaze. There, hovering at the very edge of the illumination cast by my dying fire, was a shape. It was half swallowed by the shadows of the pines, a dark mass standing completely motionless. The flickering orange light just barely licked against it, revealing the unmistakable, broad-shouldered silhouette of a human being. Wait. My mouth went dry. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I swallowed hard, trying to project a confidence I did not possess. I called out into the freezing air, my voice cracking slightly. I told whoever it was that they had startled me. I spoke loudly to Roscoe, telling him it was okay, trying to mask my escalating panic. The silhouette remained completely static. It didn't flinch. It didn't speak. Light. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the figure took a single step forward, emerging from the protective veil of the shadows. The firelight washed over him. He was a man. He wore heavy winter clothing, his face partially obscured, but his posture was unnervingly relaxed. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't apologize for sneaking up on an isolated camp in the pitch black. Instead, his voice drifted across the snow, flat, gravelly, and entirely devoid of warmth. He asked me what exactly I was doing out here, so very deep in the woods. It wasn't a question born of curiosity. It sounded like an interrogation. It sounded territorial. I kept my hand resting near my holster. I forced my voice to remain steady, answering calmly that I was just out here to enjoy nature, spending a quiet weekend with my dog. He didn't say a word in response. He just stood there, staring. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The atmosphere in the clearing had mutated into something toxic and highly volatile. Every instinct screaming inside my primitive brain told me that I was in severe, immediate danger. I tightened my grip on my holster. I locked eyes with the stranger and stated, clearly and firmly, that I was heavily armed. A low, dry chuckle scraped out of the man's throat. It was a sickening sound. He tilted his head slightly, mocking me. He asked why I was so quick to throw out threats. He asked why I wasn't offering him a seat by the fire. He asked me, with a sneer evident in his tone, where my hospitality was. Like before I could formulate a response, the man turned his back to me. He stepped away from the firelight, his heavy boots crunching into the snow, and slowly walked back into the suffocating darkness of the forest. I listened to his footsteps fade, growing fainter and fainter, until the overwhelming silence of the winter woods reclaimed the night. I didn't move for a very long time. I stood rooted to the frozen earth, my eyes burning from staring too hard into the pitch-black tree line. Roscoe pressed his body firmly against the side of my leg, shivering. I desperately wanted to pack my truck and leave, but attempting to navigate that treacherous, ice-slick trail in the dark was a death sentence. I had no choice but to wait for the sun. Moving with frantic, hyper-focused energy, I dismantled the fire. I scooped handfuls of freezing snow and smothered the glowing embers, stirring the wet ashes with a stick until absolutely nothing remained. I plunged the campsite into total darkness. I didn't want a single lumen of light acting as a beacon. I practically crawled into my tent, dragging Roscoe with me, and violently zipped the nylon doors shut. I secured the interior flaps. I knew a thin layer of fabric offered exactly zero protection against a determined intruder, but the psychological barrier was the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. I did everything I could to stave off the biting cold. I arranged my sleeping pad to create a barrier between my body and the frozen earth, which threatened to leach every ounce of heat from my bones. I kept my boots on. I kept my heavy coat zipped to my chin. I pulled a thick knit hat over my ears and cinched the hood of my winter sleeping bag tight around my face, leaving only a small gap to breathe. I cracked a chemical hand warmer and pressed it against my chest, shoving another into the bottom of my bag, near my feet. Roscoe curled up tightly against my side, his steady body heat acting as a vital anchor in the freezing dark. I lay there in the pitch black, my eyes wide open, staring at the invisible ceiling of my tent. I strained my ears, listening past the sound of my own shallow breathing, trying to pierce the extreme, unnatural silence of the woods. Time lost all meaning. It could have been an hour. It could have been 3. Then, I felt Roscoe's body go rigid against mine. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest. My blood ran cold. I stopped breathing entirely. And then, I heard the sound that will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. Crunch, crunch, footsteps. What? The steps paused. Roscoe quieted, but I could feel his ears swiveling, perked and tracking the sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They started again, but this time, they were closer, and they were much, much slower. The deliberate, agonizingly stealthy steps of a predator closing in on its prey. The footsteps moved steadily toward the center of my camp. They approached the front flap of my tent. And then, they stopped, right outside the thin nylon wall. Light, less than 2 feet from my head. Roscoe lost his mind. He threw his head back and unleashed a deafening, terrifying howl that shook the walls of the tent. Panic seized me. I grabbed his muzzle, violently choosing him in a desperate, frantic whisper, terrified that the noise would provoke whoever was standing outside into attacking. When I finally managed to quiet him, he reverted to a vicious, snarling growl, his teeth bared in the dark. The person outside did not speak. They did not announce themselves. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening to the horrificously intimate sounds of their presence. I could hear the subtle, shifting crunch of the snow as they transferred their weight from one foot to the other. I could hear the heavy, slow exhalations of their breath in the freezing air. My handgun was gripped so tightly in my right hand that my knuckles ached. The metal was ice cold. I was trapped, zipped inside a bag, inside a tent, in the middle of nowhere. I didn't want to make another threat. I knew that if I made a threat now, I would have to pull the trigger. And as I lay there, trembling in the dark, I faced a terrifying realization. I had never shot a living thing in my life, even with my life potentially on the line. Even staring down the barrel of self-defense, I didn't know if I had the psychological fortitude to take a human life. But the alternative was waiting to be butchered in a sleeping bag. My survival instinct finally overrode my paralysis. I forced my thumb back. Click. The mechanical, metallic clack of the gun's hammer cocking back sounded like a cannon firing inside the tiny tent. I raised my voice. It didn't crack this time. It was filled with desperate, feral adrenaline. I screamed through the fabric that I had a loaded gun aimed directly at the door, and that whoever was standing there needed to back away and leave immediately. I waited for a knife to slice through the nylon. I waited for the blast of a gunshot. Realistically, who else could it possibly be? What other human being was wandering miles deep into a frozen, untracked forest at 3 a.m, standing silently outside a stranger's tent? For 5 agonizing seconds, there was absolute, ringing silence. Then, the snow crunched. The footsteps began moving backward. They were slow at first, almost hesitant. The pace quickened. The slow crunches turned into the heavy, rapid thud of boots jogging through deep powder, retreating away from the camp, moving further and further into the tree line until they were completely swallowed by the night. I did not sleep. I didn't even unzip the tent flap to check if the clearing was empty. I remained locked in that exact same, frozen position for the rest of the night, my finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. my eyes burning holes into the dark. Roscoe never dropped his guard. He remained alert, his head up, his ears twitching at every phantom sound. His vigilance was the only reason I didn't completely lose my mind to the panic. I drifted into brief, hallucinatory micro-sleeps, only to jolt awake gasping for air, convinced I had heard a zipper opening. When the sky finally began to bleed a weak, gray light through the fabric of the tent, I moved with manic speed. I didn't bother folding anything. I violently stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack, collapsed the tent with trembling hands, and practically sprinted back to my truck, dragging Roscoe behind me. We drove out of those woods as the sun broke over the horizon. I never looked in my rearview mirror. I have never returned to that state forest. I sold my camping gear a month later. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but encounters like that remind you of a terrible truth. You can never, ever let your guard down, because out there in the dark, you are entirely on your own. We often associate fear with isolation. We think the monsters only hunt in the lonely, desolate corners of the world. But there is a different, much more insidious kind of terror that can find you in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. It's the creeping realization that the world you are looking at is deeply, fundamentally wrong. During the 4th of July weekend in 2025, I made the long drive up the coast from Melbourne, Florida, to Charleston, South Carolina. I was heading up to spend a few days with an old, close friend of mine named Mark. We hadn't seen each other in years. Mark was incredibly brilliant, highly logical, and was spending his summer living in a rented house in the heart of Charleston while completing a prestigious internship for his law program. The plan was simple: catch up, explore the historic city, and enjoy the holiday weekend. I arrived after a smooth drive, the humid, heavy air of South Carolina welcoming me. We spent the late afternoon playing a few rounds of pickleball as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. As night settled over the city, we headed back to his rental. Mark gave me the couch downstairs. It was situated right next to a series of large windows that looked out over a cramped, brick alleyway. It was a labyrinthine little street, bordered by an adjacent apartment building and an old, rotting, abandoned house sitting ominously across the way. The first night passed without incident. The next morning, the heat was already stifling. After another quick game of pickleball and a massive breakfast, we decided to act like tourists. We ventured deep into the historic Charleston City Market. If you've never been, the market is a chaotic, vibrant artery of the city. It is packed shoulder to shoulder with tourists, vendors selling woven sweetgrass baskets, the smell of fried seafood, and the deafening hum of 1,000 simultaneous conversations. We navigated the dense crowds, eventually breaking out of the covered market and walking out toward the sun-drenched docks by the waterfront. That was when we saw him. He was walking down the road that ran parallel to the water. In the suffocating, brutal July humidity, this man was wearing a full, immaculate wedding suit. It wasn't just a suit. It was pristine. A pitch-black tuxedo jacket, perfectly tailored trousers, a crisp, perfectly tied bow-tie, and gleaming dress shoes that reflected the harsh sun. He had a deeply and complexion and a mane of long, thick, curly black hair. But it wasn't the outfit that made my stomach drop. It was the way he was moving. Behind us, the market was a blur of frantic human energy. But this man, he was shambling. There's no other word for it. He moved with a slow, mechanical, almost painfully detached gait. His arms hung limply at his sides. He didn't look at the water. He didn't look at the cars. He seemed entirely disconnected from the reality of the bustling city around him, locked inside some invisible, silent bubble. We were standing on the corner, preparing to cross the street. If we had stepped off the curb, we would have collided directly with him. A sudden, intense wave of physical repulsion washed over me. Every alarm bell in my nervous system began ringing simultaneously. It wasn't a logical fear. It was an instinctual, primal urge to get away from whatever this thing was. I shot out my hand, grabbing Mark tightly by the bicep. I pulled him back onto the sidewalk, telling him firmly that we were not crossing that street. Mark looked at me confused, but then he looked at the man. I watched Mark's expression shift from mild annoyance to deep unease. We pivoted hard to the right, turning our backs to the water, and began walking rapidly deeper into the grid of the city. The man was moving so unnaturally slowly that we put a massive amount of distance between us in seconds. As we walked away, I looked at Mark. I told him how fundamentally wrong that guy looked. I pointed out the impossibilities. He didn't look like a vagrant struggling with mental illness. His clothes were too expensive, too perfectly pressed. There wasn't a drop of sweat on his brow despite the sweltering heat. Something about his presence was completely broken. Mark, the grounded, analytical law student, didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, agreeing that it felt off. We brushed it off as a bizarre city encounter and continued our trek. 20 minutes later, we were several blocks away, navigating a completely different, equally busy stretch of downtown Charleston. We stopped to look at the display window of an antique shop. I glanced casually down the long avenue. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. Far down the street, moving diagonally away from us, was the exact same man. The same pristine black suit, the same gleaming shoes, the same curly black hair, and he was moving with the exact same, agonizingly slow, shambling pace. My mind struggled to process the geometry of the situation. It was physically impossible. We had been walking at a brisk, athletic pace for 20 minutes. He had been moving like a glacier in the opposite direction. There was absolutely no logical route he could have taken to beat us to this specific intersection without sprinting. And yet, he looked entirely unbothered, moving at that exact same, terrifying crawl. I grabbed Mark again, pointing silently down the street. We stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring as the figure slowly drifted out of sight. The analytical side of Mark's brain was short-circuiting. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a twin. Maybe it was some bizarre, avant-garde street performance. But neither of us believed the lies we were telling each other. We forced ourselves to drop the subject and spent the rest of the day desperately trying to enjoy the city. The next day was the 4th of July. We escaped the claustrophobia of downtown and drove 20 minutes out to a barrier island to watch the fireworks explode over the Atlantic. Surrounded by the deafening booms and the smell of sulfur, the memory of the man in the suit faded into the background. We convinced ourselves he was just a glitch in our perception, a strange local eccentric. But beneath the surface, that primal unease was still festering. The following night, July 5th, was my final night in South Carolina. We had booked tickets for a historical ghost tour of the city, a staple of the Charleston tourist experience. It was a Saturday night, the culmination of a massive holiday weekend, and downtown Charleston was absolutely overflowing. The sidewalks were packed shoulder to shoulder with revelers. The humid night air was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses pouring from overflowing restaurant patios, and the yellow glow of gas lanterns illuminating the cobblestone streets. We finished our walking tour and began the trek back to Mark's rental. We were walking down one of the main thoroughfares, swimming upstream against a massive, rapidly moving crowd of people heading toward the bars. As this dense wave of humanity approached us, Mark and I both stopped dead in our tracks at the exact same millisecond. Emerging from the center of the chaotic, fast-moving crowd was the man in the wedding suit. It was a sight that defied all logic. He was exactly the same crisp eye, the same perfect hair. But the most horrifying aspect was his movement. The crowd around him was surging, walking quickly, dodging each other, talking loudly. But the man in the suit was shambling at his excruciatingly slow, rhythmic pace, right in the middle of the crush. He stood out like a jagged rock in a fast-flowing river. But here was the truly terrifying part. Nobody noticed him. Two young women were walking hurriedly on either side of him, laughing loudly. He brushed his shoulders violently between them, a physical contact that should have caused them to stumble or at least turn and apologize. They didn't even blink. They didn't break their conversation. It was as if he was entirely invisible, existing on a completely different frequency of reality. He was tied to the physical space of the crowd, but he wasn't part of it. As he drifted past us, his head snapped toward us. For one agonizing second, he made direct eye contact. His eyes were blank, entirely void of human warmth or recognition. Then his head snapped back to the front, and he continued his slow, detached march forward. Mark and I stood paralyzed on the sidewalk. We watched the sea of people swallow him, then thin out as the group passed. We tracked his crisp black silhouette as he shambled down the avenue, turning abruptly down a dark, narrow side street and disappearing from view. We didn't say a word. We didn't panic. We just began walking back to the house in a stunned, suffocating silence. The impossibility of the situation was too heavy to verbalize. The same man, the same suit, appearing multiple times across the city, defying time, defying space, moving like a machine wearing human skin. We got back to the rental house. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Mark quietly said goodnight and retreated up the stairs to his bedroom. I stayed downstairs, pulling the heavy blinds shut over the large windows facing the alleyway, and laid down on the couch, desperate for the sun to rise so I could dock to Florida. I fell into a restless, anxious sleep. Sometime in the dead of the night, I don't know the exact hour, my eyes snapped open. Tap, tap, a soft, deliberate sound against the glass of the window right above my head. My blood turned to ice in my veins. I couldn't breathe. I lay completely motionless on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind screaming at me to ignore it. After an eternity of silence, I slowly, painfully pushed myself up. I reached out with a trembling hand and peeled back the edge of the heavy blind just a fraction of an inch just. I peered out into the dark, brick alleyway. The security light from the adjacent building cast long, distorted shadows. At the very far end of the alley, just about to turn the corner into the street, was a figure. It was a man in a pitch-black wedding suit. He was walking away, but just before he stepped out of the alley and vanished into the night, he stopped. He slowly turned his upper body, looking back over his shoulder, directly at the sliver of the window where I was hiding. I dropped the blind. I sat in the dark until the sun came up. I told Mark everything the next morning while I frantically packed my bags. Mark, the man who relies on evidence, logic, and undeniable proof, sat at his kitchen table and looked pale. He didn't try to rationalize it. He admitted that the entire weekend had shaken him to his core. I am a person who believes there are things in this world we cannot comprehend. Mark is not, but whatever that entity was, it breached both of our realities. I drove back to Florida on July 6th. The miles rolled by, but the fear didn't fade. It's been months, and I know Mark still thinks about it as much as I do. Because that man in the suit felt undeniably real, yet completely impossible. And the image of him turning that corner, looking back at me in the dead of night, is a phantom that will haunt my peripheral vision forever. We fear the woods. We fear the strangers on the street. But at the end of the day, we always come home. We lock the deadbolt, we turn off the lights, and we tell ourselves that these four walls are an impenetrable fortress. I never used to be paranoid. I never double-checked my locks before bed. I never memorized the specific, groaning pitch of the floorboards in my hallway. But that completely innocent way of living died over the course of a single week last winter. I am a creature of extreme habit. I bought a small, older house in a quiet suburb a few years ago, and I live entirely alone. My routine is aggressively boring. I work remotely from a desk in my living room. I have my groceries delivered to my porch, and I don't fraternize with my neighbors. My only real excursion is driving to a 24-hour gym late at night to avoid the crowds. Because my life was so predictable, so monotonous. It took me entirely too long to recognize that my sanctuary had been breached. It started on a Tuesday. It was around 2:30 in the morning. I had fallen asleep on the couch watching a movie, the television casting a low, blue glow across the living room. I was jolted awake by a noise. Thud. It was soft. Might. Coming from the back of the house, near the kitchen. It wasn't a loud crash. It wasn't the sound of breaking glass. It was exactly the kind of ambiguous noise a homeowner desperately rationalizes away. The house is settling. The ice maker dropped a cube. The wind knocked a branch against the siding. I muted the television. I sat up, holding my breath, straining my ears into the dark hallway. The silence of the house stretched on. Nothing else happened. I convinced myself I was hearing things. Walked to the back door, verified the deadbolt was engaged, and went to bed. Wednesday morning brought the first tangible crack in my reality. I went to let some fresh air in, and as I grabbed the handle of the back door, it felt wrong. The deadbolt retracted smoothly, but the handle itself was loose. It rattled violently in the casing, like someone had grabbed it from the outside and twisted it with massive, aggressive force, stripping the internal screws. I frowned, made a mental note to grab a screwdriver later, and went about my day. Late that night, sticking to my routine, I drove to the gym at 11 o'clock. I finished my workout and pulled back into my driveway, just after midnight. I put my car in park and stared at my house. The front porch light was off. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine still idling, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I am meticulous. I never turn that light off. It stays on from dusk until dawn. I stared at the dark bulb, trying to force a memory of flipping the switch into my brain. You must have bumped it. You must have been distracted. I turned off the car and walked up the dark steps. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I left it. But for the first time since I bought the house, I felt a compulsion to check. I walked through every single room, turning on the lights, looking in the closets, checking behind the shower curtain. It was a childish exercise, but I needed to do it. The house was empty. Thursday morning, the paranoia escalated. I woke up to my alarm, reached over to my nightstand, and grabbed my phone to check the time. The battery icon was red. It was at 12%. I sat up, confused. I distinctly remembered plugging it in before I went to sleep. I looked down. The charging cable was securely plugged into the bottom of my phone. But when I traced the white cord down the side of the nightstand, the power brick was lying on the carpet. It had been physically pulled out of the wall outlet. My brain scrambled for a logical explanation. Did I knock it loose in my sleep? Impossible. The outlet was completely out of reach from the mattress, and my phone was still resting perfectly on the nightstand. The only physical way this could happen was if I had woken up in a fugue state, blindly yanked the cord from the wall, carefully placed the phone back on the table, and gone back to sleep with zero memory of the event. It sounded insane, but the alternative was too terrifying to consider. I was losing my grip. I started paying obsessive attention to my environment. Thursday night, I didn't go to the gym. I didn't turn on the TV. I turned off every light in the house, sat in the dark on my living room couch, and just listened. Wait. 0 a.m. The house began to speak. But light, thud, heavy, slow, rhythmic impacts echoing from the back of the house. My heart slammed against my ribs. I gripped the armrest of the couch. Are those footsteps? No. No. They can't be. The cadence was too heavy. It had to be a raccoon on the roof. It had to be a stray dog digging at the foundation. I live in the suburbs. There are people everywhere. I squeezed my eyes shut and held my breath until my lungs burned. The thudding eventually ceased, leaving me drowning in the quiet. Friday morning destroyed all my rationalizations. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee. As I approached the back door, my eyes caught a smudge on the pristine hardwood floor. I knelt down. Light. Mud. But it wasn't a clear footprint. It was a smeared, deliberate mess. Whoever made it had clearly realized their mistake and violently dragged the sole of their shoe across the wood, trying to wipe away the tread pattern before taking another step deeper into the house. My stomach plummeted. The air left my lungs. I live alone. I hadn't had guests in months. I don't wear shoes in the house. I slowly stood up and looked closely at the back door lock. The loose handle I had dismissed on Wednesday was covered in tiny, frantic scratches. Deep grooves were gouged into the metal around the keyhole, the unmistakable scars of someone prying at the mechanism with a thin, rigid tool. I was completely panicked. I grabbed my phone and called a locksmith, begging for an emergency appointment. I told him the lock was failing. I didn't mention the footprints. I was terrified that speaking it aloud would make it real. The locksmith arrived that afternoon, drilled out the old deadbolt, and installed a heavy-duty, reinforced lock. He handed me the new keys and assured me that no one was getting through that door without a battering ram. I felt a surge of false confidence. That night, to appease my shattered nerves, I dragged a heavy wooden dining chair over and wedged it violently under the handle of the new back door. When I went to bed, I pushed the button on my bedroom doorknob, locking myself inside. I had never locked an interior door in my life. I laid in the dark staring at the ceiling. Exhaustion finally dragged me under. I violently snapped awake. The read numbers on my alarm clock read 3:58 am. Tip, 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 tip. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of fingernails lightly, playfully tapping against the wood of my locked bedroom door. I froze. A primal, paralyzing terror hijacked my nervous system. I couldn't move my arms. I couldn't blink. I stared at the dark outline of the bedroom door, waiting for the brass knob to slowly turn. The tapping continued for a full, agonizing minute. A sadistic little game. Then, the tapping stopped. The floorboards in the hallway groaned softly as the weight shifted, and I heard the faint, muffled sound of stockinette feet slowly walking away from my room, retreating down the hall. I stayed trapped in my bed, paralyzed by fear, until the sun flooded the room. When I finally found the courage to unlock my bedroom door and step into the hallway, the house was dead quiet. I walked slowly to the kitchen. The heavy wooden chair was exactly where I left it, wedged tightly under the back door handle. The heavy-duty deadbolt the locksmith had installed yesterday was unlocked. The reinforced metal hadn't been picked. It hadn't been forced. The internal latch had simply been turned open. Reality crashed down on me with the force of a freight train. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't experiencing sleep deprivation. I wasn't dealing with a burglar trying to break in. Someone was already inside. They had been inside the house with me while I slept. They had been locking the door behind them. I sprinted to my car, locked the doors, and called 911. My voice shook so violently the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat my address 3 times. 2 cruisers arrived in minutes. The officers listened to my frantic explanation, their faces skeptical but professional. They drew their weapons and cleared the house. 10 minutes later, they emerged. They checked the perimeter. They checked the windows. The lead officer holstered his weapon and approached my car window. He sighed. "Sir, there's no sign of forced entry. The house is clear." I screamed at him that of course there was no forced entry. The intruder had the run of the inside of the house. The officer looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He suggested gently that the stress of living alone might be getting to me. He suggested that I had probably unlocked the deadbolt myself in a sleepwalking episode. But they told me to call back if anything else happened. I was entirely on my own. That night, Saturday night, I did not sleep. I turned on every single light fixture in the house. I pulled a chair into the center of the living room, facing the hallway. I placed a massive, forged steel kitchen knife on the coffee table directly in front of me. I sat there, gripping my knees, waiting. The hours crawled by. Night. Like. At 2:15 a.m., the silence broke. It was a slow, agonizing groan of old hinges protesting. The sound echoed up from the very bottom of the house. The basement. The basement door was located in a small alcove just off the kitchen, down the hallway from where I sat. An overwhelming, suffocating blanket of dread fell over me. The air in the house suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I stood up. I didn't grab the knife. My hands were shaking too badly. I walked silently down the illuminated hallway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my sternum. I reached the edge of the kitchen and looked toward the alcove. The basement door, which I kept firmly shut, was cracked open about 3 inches. The darkness radiating from that crack was absolute. I crept forward, my bare feet completely silent on the hardwood. I reached the door. I held my breath, leaned my head forward, and pressed my eye against the 3-inch gap, looking down the wooden stairs into the pitch-black abyss below. It was not my imagination. Standing perfectly still at the very bottom of the stairs, entirely cloaked in the shadows, was a silhouette of a man. I couldn't see his face. I didn't know if he was looking up at me through the crack. All I saw was the broad, solid mass of human shoulders, waiting in the dark. A primal scream tore its way out of my throat. I slammed my hand against the basement door, throwing my entire body weight into it until the latch clicked shut. I spun around, sprinted blindly through the house, tore open the front door, and bolted to my car. I locked the doors, threw the car in reverse, and peeled out of my driveway, parking sideways in the middle of the street. I dialed 911 again, screaming at the dispatcher that there was a man trapped in my basement. The police arrived in force this time, for cruisers swarmed the house, their red and blue lights throwing chaotic, strobing shadows across my lawn. They didn't patronize me this time. They drew their weapons, kicked open my front door, and stormed the house. I sat in the back of an idling cruiser, violently shivering despite the heater running on high. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the front door of my house swung open. 2 officers walked out, practically dragging a man between them. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back. He was filthy. He was completely barefoot, his soles black with grime. He wore dark, ragged clothing that looked like it had been lived in for weeks. He looked emaciated, his hair wild and matted. As they dragged him toward the cruisers, he didn't struggle. He didn't speak. And horrifiedly, he never once looked in my direction. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the asphalt, his face entirely devoid of emotion. They shoved him roughly into the back of a separate cruiser and slammed the heavy door shut. I couldn't stop shaking. My teeth were chattering so hard I couldn't form sentences when the officers tried to take my statement. The search of the house took over an hour. When the lead officer finally emerged, his expression was grim. He leaned against the open door of the cruiser I was sitting in and opened his notepad. He asked me how long I had lived alone. I stammered out my answer. He asked me to confirm my exact gym schedule, the specific hours I was out of the house. I did. The officer closed his notepad. He looked at my house, then back at me. "We found his setup," the officer said quietly. "Behind the furnace, in the back corner of your basement." Mike, my stomach turned to ash. The officer described a nightmare. They found a makeshift nest constructed from old, itchy fiberglass insulation he had ripped from the ceiling joists. Scattered around the nest were dozens of my missing food wrappers, empty water bottles I thought I had thrown away, and an extension cord running to a wall outlet where a stolen phone charger was plugged in. This man hadn't broken in to steal my television. He had broken in to live with me. He had been sleeping beneath my feet, like listening to me walk, like learning my routine, knowing exactly when I left for the gym so he could roam the house, eat my food, and retreat back into the shadows before I returned. The officer told me the man was refusing to speak, but he was facing severe charges: breaking and entering, criminal trespassing. I thought that was the end of the nightmare. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. Days later, the police released the house back to me. I couldn't sleep there. I was packing a bag to stay at a hotel. I was sitting on my couch, numbly scrolling through the camera roll on my phone to find a picture to send a friend. My thumb froze. Buried in my recent photos was an image I had not taken. It was a dark, heavily pixelated, grainy photograph. I stared at it, my brain refusing to process the geometry of the image. It was a picture of a man sleeping. It was a picture of me. I was asleep in my bed. The covers were pulled up to my chest. I looked at the timestamp on the digital file. Thursday, 3:00 AM. The exact same night, I woke up to find my phone charger unplugged from the wall. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just been living in the basement. He had been standing directly over my bed while I slept. He had unplugged my phone from the wall, used it to take a picture of my unconscious face, placed the phone neatly on the nightstand, then walked back down into the dark. I nearly vomited. I immediately called the detective assigned to my case and drove straight to the precinct to digitally transfer the horrifying evidence. The detective looked sick when he saw the photo. He told me that with this specific piece of evidence, the charges were escalating drastically. He was looking at aggravated stalking, potentially even being placed on the sex offender registry for the rest of his life. It was supposed to be comforting news. It wasn't. Putting that man behind bars doesn't undo what he broke inside my mind. It doesn't erase the trauma. The justice system cannot give me back the sanctuary of my own home. I sold the house 2 months later. But no matter where I move, no matter how many deadbolts I install or how many security cameras I mount, the damage is permanent. Because every single time I walk past a closed door in my own home, I wonder what is waiting on the other side. And I know with absolute certainty that I will never, ever walk down into a dark basement again for as long as I live. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. And tonight, before you go to sleep, check your locks. White.